Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us on a sunny afternoon. I'm Jennifer Loop. I am the secretary for Traverse Area Historical Society. And today, in conjunction with TADL, Traverse Area District Library, we have a presentation by Brian McCall. Brian is our vice president of the Traverse Area Historical Society and an Interlochen Arts Academy history instructor. And so we hope you enjoy our program. We can do questions afterwards. If you want to put questions in the chat as we are going through the presentation, I'll be monitoring that and make sure that we get those to Brian. And enjoy our presentation. I'm going to let Brian go here.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming on and joining our presentation today. As Jen said, I'm a history teacher at Interlochen. I'm also an instructor at NMC, and I teach Michigan history through Ferris State University as an adjunct as well. I've been interested in the story of the Civil War since I was knee-high to a grasshopper, like a lot of kids who like American history. It's a fascinating topic. And I have to admit, from most of the research, most of the time that I was interested in the history of the Civil War, the military aspect of it first appealed to me. And as I got a little older and more mature, I got more interested in the social, the cultural, the economics, and of course the politics of what happened during the 1860s. And when the 2020 election was starting to ramp up in a lot of the states around the United States because of the pandemic, they'd already been working towards making voting more accessible through mail-in ballots or absentee ballot applications. I was really reminded about what had happened during the 1864 election of Abraham Lincoln, the re-election of Abraham Lincoln. And that's one of the reasons that with the 2020 election and some parallels between that election and the consequences that we're going to probably see for the next 4 years and beyond, and this amazingly consequential election of 1864. You could probably put it on a list of presidential elections on the top 5 in terms of impact. The counterfactuals that I'll talk about at the end of this lecture are fascinating and or terrifying, depending on your point of view. The amount of interest that this election gathered at the time, at a time where I spoke to my students last week and told them that at 55 years old, I'm exactly as old as American democracy is. We really have never had a fully functional democracy until after the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So 100 years before that, the election of 1864 is one that, while you have widespread participation among those with the right to vote, huge swaths of people without the right to vote. And I always wanted, when we talk about elections in American history, to make the point about how limited the franchise was, who could vote, when they could vote, how often were they able to vote when they weren't physically present, using voice ballots as opposed to secret ballots, all of the changes that have happened in the way that we administer elections. And obviously we got a big primer in why elections matter and how we vote matters in this last experience that we just all lived through. So that's one of the reasons why we're talking about the election of 1864 today. It's relevant to events of our current headlines. One of the other side notes that I thought was interesting is this election is the first one that takes place during a war in which the United States in 1864 had never experienced anything remotely close to the scale of deployment and forces engaged that we see in the Civil War. The American Revolution, which is usually chosen as the war that has the biggest comparative impact on life in the United States while it was happening, because it was happening in the United States, is an extremely small scale affair in relationship to the number of men involved and the number of women involved in various capacities in the fighting of the Civil War. In the South alone, 1/3 of the male population of the South who are white are in uniform during 1861 to 65. That's an incredible number. I often quiz my students on what's the percentage of Americans today who are in active duty military service and their families. And as of 2021, it is below 1%. 99% of us don't have an active member in the military that we're related to or ourselves. So during the Civil War, this is the absolute opposite. For a lot of young men in the South, the idea that you wouldn't be in the service was anathema, or you played the idea that you had to stay at home to monitor life on the plantations. In the North, it's a little more complicated. The population of the North was bigger. The initial burst of enthusiasm in 1861, by the end of 1862, had petered out in terms of recruitment. Recruitment officers for the state regiments had to pay big bounties to keep men enlisting. Stories about what was actually happening on the front, the romantic side of war, was long gone by the end of 1862. Very few people who came back from the battlefield had any romantic notions about war at that point. But in 1861, the lithographs and the fancy posters and what it looks like, what men look like in uniform, was quite appealing. But that was done by 1862. By 1864, there's an enormous amount of war weariness setting in the North. And that's the other unique thing about this election. That's the only place where this election takes place, is in the North. 11 states of the Confederacy are not participants in the 1864 election. They were in 1860. They didn't allow Lincoln to be on the ballot, but there was a combined election of all the states before the Civil War. The South rejected the result, and the war then occurred. So this election is kind of a standalone in a lot of ways. We won't have another presidential election during war on a large scale until 1944, when Franklin Roosevelt, presidential election, when Franklin Roosevelt ran for this unprecedented fourth term, probably against his own better judgment and certainly against the advice of his doctors, but he did it anyway, and then passed away quickly afterwards. Since then, we haven't had a real full-scale wartime election. So 1864, 1944 are the two. So this one is kind of a template for a lot of different parts of American history that we can look at as we continue down. One of the things I found really interesting about this election is that it was another example of when you have a presidential system of government and you do not use a parliamentary system of representation. If you have a sizable portion of public opinion in favor of one position, but they're not big enough to be a majority, they're going to have to find a way to coalesce within one of two parties. Another question from 2020 that we may be wrestling with in the future, particularly on the side of the Republican Party as it moves forward. And in the case of the 1864 election, both the Democrats and the Republicans, the newer of the two parties at that time, the Republicans, were both facing potential splits in their party membership and potential candidates for the presidency in 1864. I was talking about this with my students a couple of days ago, and I compared it to what would be the equivalent. What's going to happen in 1864 is Senator Biden wins the Democratic nomination, and Senator Sanders, after losing, decides to form his own party in the summer and the fall of 2000, and forms a separate political party with himself at the top of the ticket. In effect, that is what's going to happen to Abraham Lincoln's Republicans in 1864 in the form of John C. Fremont, the famous Pathfinder and former candidate of the Republicans in 1856. The Republicans are not united in 1864, but boy, would they have never traded places with the Democrats of the same time. There probably has never been an election within the Democratic Party that divided it more than 1864 on an extremely fundamental question: war or peace. And you'll find fewer topics that will divide people permanently than that one. And that is where the Democrats were, at least obviously in the North. The Southern Democrats are a non-entity in this race. Let's start with the results kind of at the beginning, and then we'll kind of move through the story of the nominations, and then get to, at the end, the effect of this election. And I wanted to bring into this also the military component that really drives how this election is going to play out in terms of the general election. But let's begin with the results. This is a big, wide victory in the Electoral College for President Lincoln and the Republicans. They win 212 Electoral College votes to 21 for their Democratic opponent, the former general. Actually, he was still a general in the Army when he ran, George B. McClellan, who is the Democratic Party candidate. 55% of the popular vote goes to the Republicans. So they win both electorally, they win at the popular vote. And one of the reasons that this election was spurred on is the soldiers' vote, which is related to this question of absentee ballots and voting away from home, was critical for the Republicans in several states. And when I get to the meat of the lecture, how the soldiers voted in many cases decided how people voted at home and what they felt about the scope of the war and what this meant. There'll be some parts of this that I hope will resonate with you in terms of how important the franchise is and why we have to do as much as we can to protect our right to have it and hopefully expand it to people who are deserving of it. If you time traveled back to the spring of 1864 and you were a political pollster whose stock, as you guys all know, has kind of fallen a little bit in the last two election cycles, and you'd ask people, who's going to win? Will Lincoln run for re-election? Undoubtedly. And does he have a chance of winning? The answer would have been, who would vote for Abraham Lincoln? Again, after what's happened in the last 4 years, or at least 3.5. By May of 1864, when we think of the Civil War today, most Americans, when they have a rough narrative of the way that this war plays out, they know the name Gettysburg. And they may even know when it happened, July 1st through the 3rd of 1863. If they're somewhat better Civil War historians, they may know that at the same time, 1,000 miles away on the Mississippi River, Ulysses S. Grant and his Army of the Tennessee will take Vicksburg, Mississippi, and they will open up the Mississippi River from north to south. And those two battles and victories happen almost simultaneously. So a lot of Americans will look at that in history and go, well, that's when the war was decided. That's the turning points. The South can't win. The North will eventually win. And those battles are incredibly important, but they didn't end the war. Far from it. If they did anything, they forced the Confederacy to realize that if they were going to have a chance at winning, they were going to have to turn their forces inward and buckle down and become like a turtle and make the Union Army dig them out, one dead rebel soldier at a time. And they would exact an enormous price for that. And that realization in the South came in the fall of 1863. Their chances of winning a quick victory by defeating a Northern army in the North or stopping the Union forces under Grant from slowly strangling the South on the West were over. And their real chance of victory was to convince enough people in the North that the war wasn't worth winning, that their sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers were dying in a worthless cause. And eventually, by this time, their chances of this happening were getting slimmer by the day, convinced the British and French to at least acknowledge the existence of the Confederacy and potentially be partners with them to defeat the North. All of these things by the spring of 1864 are very, very viable. They're total possibilities. The war can end in a stalemate, It can end in a defeat of the Union armies at a decisive point. It could end in a revolt in the Lincoln cabinet over the continued expansion of African-American rights in the form of freedom in the South and enlistment of African-American soldiers in new regiments. All of these things were possible in the spring of 1864. The casualty figures of the Civil War are really a remarkable story in American historical research. For most of the people on this call, I would imagine that you may have heard the number 600,000. That over the course of 4 years, 600,000 Americans died as a result of the Civil War. We know that's not right anymore. Over the last 15 years, the research has shown there's been an additional between 150 and 200,000 more deaths associated with Civil War combat. The real number is somewhere north of 750,000. Some of these men, the records were lost. Some of them, they had died at home. Some were not registered correctly in the hospitals before they died. It's an enormous death toll. And it was reaching very deeply by the spring of 1864. And those of you who know a little American Civil War history know it's going to get higher. When the roads dried and the armies could march again, the blood would begin to flow in buckets. And there was no quick fix around that. The realization that this war was not going to end anytime soon in a quick victory was fairly common knowledge by, only the most woolly-headed romantics who thought that there was a chance for a dramatic stroke to end it all at once. No, this was going to be a hard slog. And there was no cheap way to do this in terms of human life. The commitment that both sides had made was so high that the only way it was going to end was with a fight to the finish, with everything that entailed. So this war weariness factor is very real in the spring of 1864. There's no denying it. The other problem for the North was that up to this point, Northern military success, if you want to call it that, had been largely based on just a oversupply of everything they needed compared to what the Southerners were dealing with. Union armies rarely went without food, ammunition, or shoes. And all those things were in short supply in the South. There's a material abundance. The railroad system of the Northern military machine had been modernized, efficient, and got men and material and food and supplies where they were needed and when they were needed. What was lacking were competent generals to operate this big machine. They were beginning to appear. I mentioned U.S. Grant in the West, his subordinate, William Tecumseh Sherman, Sheridan. There are other corps commanders who are starting to show promise if they can stay alive long enough. Remember, Civil War generals led near the front, and many of them died during the fighting. If they can live long enough to operate this gigantic military machine, then they might have a chance at defeating the South. Southern generalship on the other side had peaked probably by mid-62. And after the death of Stonewall Jackson in May of 63, there's still very competent leadership in the form of Robert E. Lee and Longstreet and Joseph Johnson in the Southern armies, but the number of qualified, competent commanders was shrinking just through the cost of war. So from a point of view of leadership, the South still had the whip hand in compared to Northern generals. The one big plus that the North had that was hard to see unless you could look at a big map, and people don't really use maps to decide who's winning or losing a war, was the continued efficiency and size and power of the United States Navy, which the Southerners really didn't have a response for. They couldn't counter the dozens of ships and boats and riverboats and gunboats that the US Navy was putting into operation, commissioning, and moving up and down through the inland waterways of our rivers, and then slowly but surely strangling the coastline of the South and cutting them off from their outside help from Britain and France. So it's a balance sheet in 1864 of both emotional factors in this wave of death that everyone knows will come, and all of these material factors that seem to favor the North more than the South. Southerners, by spring of 1864, are under no illusions that they can outbuild, outshoe, basically, outfit with shoes their armies and compared to the Northerners. They're hoping on Southern grit, Southern tenacity, and the advantage of operating and defending your home. And that's their main calling card. So that's kind of the military situation of May. And if you're Abraham Lincoln running for re-election, none of that looks good. I mean, there's some things you could point to say, here's the progress we've made, but at what cost? And what will you have to pay? And he literally could see the homes of the men who would soon march off to their deaths when the next push of the summer of 1864 would begin. That had to be extremely daunting from a political point of view, obviously from a moral point of view, and from the belief that if he lost this election and the Republicans are repudiated, what would a revived Democratic Party do in the event of a victory at the polls in November of 64? And that's where we'll finish our lecture with some of the counterfactuals that could have happened. So that's our military situation. The British and the French, I think I told you earlier, are watching this election extremely closely. The European powers are very, very interested in the travails of the United States. And I think for a lot of Americans who don't like to think about foreign policy, no European power, with maybe the exception of the Russians of all people, were favoring Northern victory. In terms of their governments, almost every European power looked at a defeat of the North and a defeat of the United States as an extremely desirable outcome to the American Civil War. Now, what that wasn't true, though, was for a lot of common people. People in northern English cities who relied on, for years, their jobs sewing or weaving American slave-grown cotton into textiles were starving. In Manchester, in Birmingham, in Leeds, they had nothing to eat, they couldn't pay their rent, and yet many of them refused to support the idea of their British government going on the side of the Confederacy to save the lives of the fortunes of the Southern planters. I've always felt that they're kind of an unheralded heroes of the American Civil War, the poor of British industrial cities who do not want to have slavery advance for moral reasons and for economic ones. And the British and the French governments had to deal with the reality, even though these people might not vote, they don't have the right to vote like in the United States, they're a force to be reckoned with. Unhappy, teeming cities of unemployed textile workers is not any government's dream. Most of the aristocrats of both of these countries, of the people on top, they would have loved for the South to have won the Civil War. Loved it. Why? It permanently weakens the United States. It makes the United States a bit player in a larger game. Like I said, the only real European power that was interested in supporting Northern victory through the war and after were the Russians, of all people, in terms of the Tsarist court, for various reasons. It's a pretty interesting story. But for the ones that matter, the British, the French, remember there's not a united Germany at this time. It's Prussia and a collection of other North German states, but there's no German counterweight to British-French interests yet. They're not interested in American power. That's the farthest thing from their minds. So that's the international situation. Let's get to the politics. And there's some things about this election that some of you might not know. Lincoln is the first American president to be reelected in 30 years, not since 1832. Andrew Jackson had won reelection. Every other election after that had been a one-term president. He's the first Northern president to be reelected. Remember the early American history, it's highly weighted towards Southern and particularly Virginian candidates for the presidency. In one of the terrible twists of history, Lincoln's vice president from his first term, Hannibal Hamlin, who was a very respected Maine politician, back in the days when the vice presidency's role was extremely limited, basically you wake up in the morning and ask about the health of the president, he wasn't interested in another 4 years of waiting for Lincoln to pass away. And he declined or was easily dissuaded from joining the ticket in 1864 once the Republicans established their ticket. Instead, Lincoln really wanted to bring somebody from the Democratic Party who was in favor of prosecuting the war. And that's how we get Andrew Johnson, the war governor of Tennessee, a former senator, who was an absolute adamant opponent of the Confederacy, but also an absolute adamant opponent of racial equality. And he would have been probably ambivalent on the end of slavery, but he was certainly not ambivalent on anything approaching equality for African Americans. Never. But that's who Lincoln looks to balance the ticket out and make his National Union Party, not a Republican Party, but a new party only for this election, look appealing to Westerners, potentially border state voters. Let's talk about the other politics, the other side of the Republican Party. The abolitionist movement had very little public support for most of its public history from the 1830s on. Rare person to stand up publicly for the abolition of slavery and to go as far as William Lloyd Garrison had gone to advocate for racial equality in all forms. I mean, this is just you could probably put the number of people who felt that way in one of my classrooms. By the 1840s, those numbers go up slightly. By the 1850s, there are more public abolitionists and prominent ones, but they were always on the outside edge of American politics. They're never people with huge power and influence, even with the soaring rhetoric of the most famous African American of the age, Frederick Douglass. They're not politically powerful people. And the Republican Party, for all of its high rhetoric about where the country needed to go, was never a party of racial equality at its core. These were old Whigs and free soil Democrats and people who wanted to see the end of slavery, but not racial integration or racial equality. So where do the people who believe in those concepts go? They form a small group called the Radical Republicans. We'll hear more of them in Reconstruction after the time frame of my election. But Radical Republicans are people that are seeing the Civil War in biblical and cataclysmic terms. They are not going to let this crisis go without maximizing what they believe to be true, that in order for America to be the country that it claims to be in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, it needs to be a country based on racial equality. And for that, they begin to split. And this split is not fatal to the Republican larger project, but it is worrisome. The Republicans were very concerned about who they might lose and where they might lose to radical Republican opposition on the left side of their ledger when they would go up in the general election. Fremont, as some of you know, is a very complicated person. If you've not studied him, he's worth a look. And he's he was willing to hang his hat on an anti-Lincoln left wing to continue to run as a candidate as an opposition to the conciliatory effect of the moderate approach of the Lincoln Republicans and the National Union Party, until the very almost 1 month before the election. He'll finally drop out in September of 1864. As you can imagine, Democrats who wanted to win did anything and everything to encourage radical Republicans to break off from the National Union Party. And in American politics, in recent years, we've seen, you can call it dirty tricks, you can call it whatever you want, of having a system of trying to get your people to vote for you while not voting for the other guy. But the National Union Party is the product of Lincoln and his brain trust of the cabinet and other Republicans who believe the chance to win the war has to come with his reelection and a Republican Party resurgent enough to finish the war to the end. And this party comes up with, they nominate him early in the summer of 64 in June in Baltimore. And here's their platform: pursuit of the war until the Confederacy has surrendered unconditionally. That's critical. That #1 plank. There's no deal with Jefferson Davis. There's no deal with the Confederate Congress. A constitutional amendment for the abolition of slavery. They'll follow through on that pledge if you watch the movie Lincoln, which is a fantastic portrayal of Lincoln at the last year of his life. Aid to disabled Union veterans. The beginnings of our national welfare state are found in that plank. The number of widows, orphans, and disabled Union veterans who apply for pensions to the federal government as reward for service and the wounds that they received will form the basis of eventually our Social Security system, Medicare, and Medicaid. That's where it began. 3, continued European neutrality. Well, how are they going to get that? What that meant was that the National Union Party was absolutely going to make sure that there was no European interference in American affairs, and especially North American affairs, meaning the Canadians will watch what's happening on their side of the border, and we are going to watch very carefully what Europeans are doing in Mexico, which will be an issue very soon during this period. Enforcement of the Monroe Doctrine, same concept. Encouragement of immigration to bring more Irish, Germans, and anyone who could get on a boat to come to the United States and start a new life. That goes along with the Homestead Act and the Free Soil movement that the Republican Party was based on. A construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. And then finally, it praises the use of Black troops and Lincoln's management of the war. So that's the Union Party platform. And that's what Lincoln and the Republicans ran on. In 1864, I want to go back to Andrew Johnson for a moment. His nomination to the party, to the platform, here he is. It makes sense politically. It really did. Now, in the aftermath of everything that's going to happen with the stop-start of Reconstruction, the unfair treatment of African Americans that have continued to this day, the inability of Northern whites to realize just what it was going to take to turn the South into a place of free soil and free labor and equal rights. Now this seems like the greatest tragedy of this story. Lincoln's assassination may have happened anyway, but Andrew Johnson as his vice president didn't have to happen. And the North and the United States will lose the 4 years of his presidency in dithering and dathering over impeachment and everything else that went with his presidency. while they really needed to focus on what was the future of the country in the aftermath of this horrible war. It was an extreme distraction. He will reverse within days of taking office Sherman's very famous field order number 15 that he issues in Savannah, Georgia in January of 1865 to provide 400,000 acres along the Georgia, South Carolina coast, former planters and plantations land to freeholding African Americans, the famous 40 acres and a mule pledge that Sherman made. And my students have just talked about this in class of what would our country have looked like without Andrew Johnson at the helm during these critical months in the aftermath of Lincoln's death. It's one of the great counterfactuals of the 1864 election. But for the Republicans, they had to unite they really didn't want to take a chance at not having a war Democrat and someone from a Western state on that ticket. They knew that they needed it to balance it out and make it appealing to people who were not in favor of abolition from the beginning, who were not in favor of Black equality, and who were not in favor of the Emancipation Proclamation, but they wanted to win the war. So they made that choice. Lincoln did. So that is the setup for the Republicans and the National Union Party. Let's get to the candidates on the other side, McClellan and Mr. Pendleton from Ohio, who's his running mate. The Democrats have a really huge challenge in 1864, but like I said in May, it didn't seem as daunting given the trajectory of the war, which had been terrible. Even after Gettysburg, even after Vicksburg, anyone reading the papers in late 1863, 1864 would have wondered, will this ever end? How? And without bloodshed on a biblical scale, impossible. That is the number one plank for the Democrats, is to play on the concept of war weariness. The second one, though, is as old as America and is as old as America and apple pie, and that's racism. The Democratic platform of 1864 is absolutely unapologetically racist. It is constantly emphasizing in speeches, campaign posters, and rallies the fear of freed Black men coming north in hordes, you pick your language, taking the jobs of hardworking Americans who can only be a hardworking American if you have white skin. That's the second bullet in their arsenal. And they fire it as often and as frequently as they can. They use every trick in the book to try to make sure Americans who have the right to vote know that if you give Lincoln re-election, African-American men will be coming for your daughter. They don't lie. They don't gild the lily, I guess is the best way to put this. One of the most racist campaigns in American history, and that's saying something. The McClellan, it's hard to know where he stood on the question of using race as the tool to go after Lincoln and the Republicans, but he wasn't willing to say no to it, that's for sure. But as you're looking at some of my images here, of the two sides, the Republicans and the National Union Party had an ace in the hole against the Democrats, and it's illustrated in this great cartoon. They are completely split on the fundamental question of the Civil War. Continue to fight it or make peace with either a permanent Confederacy or bring the 11 states back into the Union with slavery. Either would have been anathema to most voters, but that is what the Democrats are faced with. They have both planks in their party. And some of you may have watched the two virtual conventions we had in the summer this year, and both parties approached it very differently. The National Union Convention of June is largely a unified Republican Party with some war Democrats and very little dissension. to getting Lincoln back on the ballot. But the convention that the Democrats host in August is an absolute catastrophe. It's one of the worst run conventions in American political history because their candidate disagrees with the main plank to the party, which is let's end the war. What a disaster. And he came out looking weak and feckless and someone who had no principles whatsoever. And those of you who have studied McClellan's military campaigns, there may have been something to this character issue against him. That said, he's quite the dashing figure. A lot of Americans probably have heard of George B. McClellan if they studied the Civil War because they associate one big plus that he brought to the Union cause. He was the great organizer. He highly placed West Point graduate, world traveler, had traveled to Europe, had been at the courts of various European rulers, had witnessed European battles firsthand, came back in the aftermath of the start of the Civil War, quickly achieved high status as the commander of the Army of the Potomac, and then spent the fall of 1861 building the Army of Potomac into a very formidable military machine. The Prussian Otto von Bismarck was reading some newspapers in Germany about the progress of the American military, and initially kind of dismissed the U.S. Army or the Northern Army as a bunch of farmers who are learning to play soldier compared to his Prussian guards and regulars. But his own army's officers traveled to the United States. They watched what was happening. By the spring and summer of 1863, the Army of the Potomac that McClellan largely builds is a lethal military weapon. And in the hands of a really good commander on the field, like Ulysses S. Grant, it's a decisive military weapon. For that, you can give McClellan a fair amount of credit. But his skills as an organizer were never matched with his decisiveness in the battlefield, and certainly not his decisiveness as a candidate. He has really the most kind of the hardest job of any candidate who's running for president in the midst of a national catastrophe, is that he had to wait for events to break his way. And here's one of my favorite cartoons from this. They were really skilled. When you don't have TV and you have to use your imagination, that's a fantastic image of Lincoln and McClellan together. The big problem McClellan has to wait is, in effect, he has to wish that the force that he had built would be defeated on the battlefield. The men that he had trained to fight would have to lose in order for him to win. And he wanted the war to end with a Union victory, but he didn't want the war to end with African-American equality and conceivably with the end of slavery. He was perfectly willing, apparently, to let slavery to continue. This is one of the most famous pictures of the two of them together. You can see the height difference between McClellan and Lincoln. This picture is taken right in the aftermath or just before the Battle of Antietam. And Lincoln was quite put out with McClellan at this point. He had fired him twice. And the final time he fired him was the last time that McClellan would ever see a command in the U.S. Army. His failure to follow up the Battle of Antietam was one misstep too many for Abraham Lincoln. He needed generals who would fight and not continually write for more reinforcements and time to train. There's something personal between the two of them. I would imagine that Lincoln on election night, when he realized that he was going to win in a landslide, and had to have a double feeling of both vindication. It was the good thing for the country and good thing for him too, to beat George B. McClellan. He got to fire him and to defeat him. So this is the two sides. The Democrats, by the way, the split part of war versus peace Democrats. The peace Democrats, some of you may have heard of them, they're referred to as Copperheads. And the Copperheads are as close as you're going to get to pro-Confederacy Northerners as was legally allowed in a wartime situation. Some of you know that Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, and he used his police power to arrest and deport, literally, some of the leading Copperheads. He had them picked up in the middle of the night, put in chains, ridden to pickets where the Union Army faced off against the Confederacy, and then marched them across under a flag of truce and said, if you like the Confederacy so much, you can go live in it. That was one way to handle the Copperheads who were writing how the war effort was doomed and Lincoln was a baboon, and the only salvation was that a bullet would end this all. Well, eventually that's what will happen for Abraham Lincoln. Here's some of the more racist imagery that the Democrats are going to use. The race in the end is determined on the battlefield. Two places, actually, battlefield and at the campgrounds. The battlefield is the part that when you had a Union Army in the North being led by competent commanders with access to every tool of war that the 1860s would provide and the willingness to use them. The Lincoln-Grant bargain, in effect, is this, that Abraham Lincoln said to Ulysses S. Grant, win the war. And Ulysses S. Grant said, it's going to cost us. And Lincoln said, I'll have to write that check, and so will these boys. And they did. And beginning in the spring of '64, as the roads dried, Lincoln gives Grant the green light to launch multiple offenses to penetrate the South in 3 places. But the main event is going to be in Virginia, the classic battlefields of starting at Old Manassas all the way down to the gates of Richmond. And Grant fights Lee in a series of incredible, brutal, bloody engagements. But the first one is probably the most important, what's known as the Battle of the Wilderness, which was hell on earth for anyone involved in it. At the end of it, men died in the forest fires, being wounded first and burned to death afterwards because no one could save them. The Army of the Potomac is bloodied and battered, and so is Lee, but he's still in position. And Grant makes the fateful decision to take his army and march south, not retreat. The first time that had happened in the whole history of the war. When the Union soldiers realized that they were not retreating after this, what appeared to be a defeat, at least tactically, the cheer went up, and you probably could hear it in Washington. And as they turned and marched south, Lee had to counter. And the campaign of 1864 in Virginia it isn't pretty, and it is bloody, and many, many men will die on both sides. But of the two sides, the Confederacy could afford them less. And Union soldiers had to know that if their unit was called to be at the leading edge, their chances of survival were slim. Some may know the story of the attack at Cold Harbor, which is outside of Richmond. And Lee had fortified an incredibly tough position to attack. Grant looked at it, thought it was worth a try, and assaulted it in the morning at great loss. When the retreating soldiers came back to their original positions, he ordered the next corps up. Those men, this is at a time when most American soldiers did not carry identification with them. There are no dog tags, there are no identity discs. Some carried, but very few did. Those men fell out of their ranks, grabbed pencil and paper, wrote their names and addresses on pieces of paper and pinned them on the backs of their coats, and then marched off to what Grant said was the only decision he regretted in the whole Civil War, the second assault at Cold Harbor. This will culminate in Lee finally being pushed out of the lines that he wanted to keep and go down to a town outside of Richmond called Petersburg, where Grant encircles him continues to encircle, and the war goes into a preview of the Western Front of World War I. Trenches, dugouts, artillery siege, and it will continue that way and through the early spring of 1865. In the West, the Union Army is largely ineffectual in stopping the Confederacy from continuing to operate in Texas and Louisiana and southern Alabama. But the army under William Tecumseh Sherman will start to march from Tennessee into Georgia. And they're initially stopped, but then they push forward again. Like Grant, Sherman would not quit. And when the Confederacy finally gave up trying to confront his army directly after failing to defeat him in front of Atlanta, the Southern Army in front of Atlanta moves north out of the way of Sherman, and Sherman continues to move south. These two killer blows will mark the end of the Confederacy. For people reading the newspapers and for George B. McClellan, by the early fall of 1864, he must have known he was going to lose. The chance for him to win had been taken out of his hands. When this race is all over with, the votes of the soldiers are really the part that I wanted to kind of finish with. 40,000 active duty soldiers vote in the states that allowed it to happen. During the summer, the following states passed special laws or special elections to allow soldiers to vote absentee, and they are California, which would make sense, Kansas, Kentucky, Maine, Michigan, Rhode Island, and Wisconsin. And those states, soldiers were allowed to go to the camp officers, meet with a state official who would have either come down by train or riverboat with a bushel full of ballots and be able to take their votes in camp while they were still in uniform, while they were still on active duty. And the images that you will see on some of the slides here are of these soldiers coming up to vote. The other thing that would happen is that Republican-run states tried to find ways to rotate men home in time for them to vote and then return back to active duty. So men from Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York State, actually New York's a democratically controlled state at the time, but the New England states, they did what they could to allow men that were on active duty to come home and vote and then return. But these states that allowed the voting in camp were really important. The men who vote against McClellan are an interesting bunch. Many of them probably remembered his rule of the Army of the Potomac from 61 and 62 and decided that he was not who they wanted to have as president. 40,000 vote, 30,000 vote for the National Union Party. And here's some of the voting that's taking place here. You have a clear preference for the soldiers, for Lincoln, and to follow through with what they had been fighting for, to not let the race of the presidency take away what they were gaining on the battlefield. The upshot of this is that some of these soldiers, and we had this incident happen, they've changed the laws in some states to stop this, but some of the soldiers voted and marched off and died before the election results were finished. Their votes were counted. Today, most states don't allow that to happen. If you are voting and then are deceased afterwards before the election is finished, your votes are not counted. In fact, that happened to several people in Michigan this year. So you have this is a great image of, we're gonna go back to that one real quickly here. Yeah, this is the classic one of how Lincoln and McClellan are both appealing to the soldiers' votes. And this one's actually a pro-McClellan image, that Lincoln is the cause of the deaths and McClellan is the savior of these soldiers. I like that one a lot. It was a fascinating election. By October, it's clear that Lincoln's going to win and win big. And the capper was after Sherman. Here's some of the racist imagery that the Democrats use right here. The race to the sea, or the march to the sea, after the defeat of the Confederacy at Atlanta, allowed Sherman to march to Savannah, Georgia. And on his way, he began to send more updates to Lincoln when he could get access to a telegraph line, telling him where the army was and how far they'd gone in the South. The news of this cascades out of the newspapers, and voters who haven't decided by this point are tilting very heavily towards the National Union Party. In the end, it's clear that, here's my totals for you. I'll give you some of the stats for this race. Lincoln wins. There's 1,129 counties that vote in 1864. Lincoln won 728 of them, 64.5% of the counties. McClellan carried 400 counties. One county in Iowa was split 50-50. This is the last election that the Republicans will win in Maryland. The Democrats dominate Maryland politics for the foreseeable future. And when you add it all up, it solidified Lincoln's power to go to the Congress and the House of Representatives and make his case for the 13th Amendment and the final end of legal slavery in the United States. So it is an incredibly inconsequential election. I know I'm at time here now, but I wanted to kind of finish with a few counterfactual possibilities in the event that things had gone the other way. And here are some of them. The battlefield decided this election, and military history and is really appealing to a lot of people for one particular reason. By the way, most of the research for this presentation comes from this book from John C. Waugh. That is the classic book on the election of 1864. If you're wondering where I got most of my facts from. And here's some of the stats on how it looks. Red for Republican, blue for Democrats. And you can see how thickly the Democratic vote is in Kentucky and in Maryland and New York City, a Democratic stronghold. Grand Traverse County, if you can see it up there, is a red county. It had been for a long time, still is. And here's the popular vote breakdown here. 45-55. So this is an overwhelming victory for Lincoln. And his second inaugural. And the image from the Capitol. Some of you may watch the movie Lincoln and see that Steven Spielberg recreates this scene. I don't know if any of you know that out in the audience here, and he is visible if you use a microscope or to look at this plate carefully, but John Wilkes Booth is waiting. And he's watching this speech, making his plan for the assassination that he'll launch a month and a half later. So what are the counterfactuals for this? Let's say the Union Army loses and is soundly defeated in all of its campaigns in the West and in the East. Would the soldiers have continued to vote for more war? That's a very good question. Where would the fence sitters have gone who decide so many of American elections? Of the undecided voters existed in 1864 as they did in every election. In some elections, they're absolutely, when it's a very close divide, they are the most important voters. Where would they have gone in the event of a continued bloodbath with no end? And had Lincoln lost, where would the Democratic Party had gone with their new power. What would McClellan have done with this victory? That is one of the great unanswered questions or great counterfactuals of American history. Would he have accepted the Confederacy? Would he said to the 11 states of the Confederacy, come back with slavery? Would he, in effect, say, leave with slavery? Would he have said to the Europeans, you're now ascendant, the United States will never be a thorn in your side. If you wish to operate in the Western Hemisphere, you're welcome to it. No one knows the answers to those questions. I think they're really fascinating to think of the United States as two countries with two governments, and one with slavery and one without. Or maybe one with slavery and one with slavery light, because the border states at this point still had slaves. Maryland, Kentucky, part of the grease that Lincoln was using to hold this all together was the Emancipation Proclamation didn't apply to those states. Would the Emancipation Proclamation been revoked? Any of these are possibilities, and we, without the, with the benefit of hindsight, we can kind of guess about what these outcomes would have looked like, but it's an incredibly important election. And with that, I am finished. If we have time for questions, I'm willing to take them in chat. I believe that's how that works now.
Yeah, we certainly do have time still here, and I'm trying to scroll through. We did just get one in the chat. I'm trying to see if anyone's raising hands. If they have their video, I can try to unmute them.
Be happy to answer any.
Yeah.
I need to drink thirst though.
Yeah, that was a good long talk. Can you see the chat, or do you want me to read it to you?
If you can read them to me, that would be great.
Yeah,
I'll look and see if I can. I think I might have to stop share
great.
to do that. Let's see.
Okay. Was there any appeals to women to urge their husbands, brothers, fathers to vote one way or another?
That's a great question. When the race is over and Lincoln is dead, the question of whether or not African-American men will get the right to vote is going to be coming up. And women, both African-American, but mostly white women, white middle class and upper class women, were incensed, the ones that were interested in suffrage, that they were not included in that conversation. But the women of both the North and the South, and we'll stick with the ones in the North right now, have such a burden to deal with this war. Prices went up through the roof. Inflation was incredibly high. Their sons are gone. Their husbands are gone. Their brothers are gone. And the mix of emotions about what's the right thing to do and where should we push our men to go to settle for peace or finish this thing to the end had to be incredibly overwhelming for some of them. I think on balance, most of them probably would have supported Lincoln. Without the ability to count their votes, we don't know. But that's a great, great question. Little Women, the Louisa May Alcott story, kind of as a centerpiece of this, what it was like to be female in the midst of this incredible period in American history. What's your next one? Oh, I think I might be able to, let's see. I get the chat. Yeah, I can read them too.
Oh, okay.
Great.
I was going to say, yep. Well, and that was a comment on her last question there too.
Oh, right. Yes. Oh, this is a very good friend of mine. So that's great to see that who's writing that question. I love it.
Mm-hmm. I am looking to see if anyone wants to raise their hand with a question. Oh, we've got Peg. Let's see if I can figure this out. Yay. You should be unmuted, Peg.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So my question is, the Northern Republicans who wanted to get rid of slavery, but were very much not for equality of Blacks, what was their theory for wanting to get rid? Was it economic that they wanted to get rid of slavery?
It's a mix of moral and economics. And you would have seen both being used as political reasons for doing this. The moral reason is self-evident, but
Right.
the economic one is that with a slave society and a slave economy as enshrined in law, what does that say about free labor and free people? One of the examples I use in my classes is that the Dred Scott decision, if you read it carefully, the one that's handed down in 1858, in effect legalizes slavery anywhere in the United States. No state can stop it. Our cherry industry in Traverse City could have been a slave-run industry. All of the resort properties that were starting to sprout up as northern places to go and have a retreat from the heat of Chicago or St. Louis could have been operated by complete slave economy systems. It would have been completely legal. All of the crops that have to be handled by hand are fruit industries along the western shore of Michigan. Slaves. What would stop it? Not the law. And that is one of the number one economic reasons for being against it as an institution.
So you could hold,
yeah.
So you could hold that and still feel like the blacks were a lesser race.
And the life of Lincoln and Lincoln's fluid attitudes about race and ethnicity are perfect to use this as an illustration. He goes into the White House in 1861 as an absolute racist in every sense of the word. And his goal, as he states at his first inauguration, is we're friends, we're not enemies. I'm not going to interfere with your institutions. I feel that they're wrong and immoral, but I don't have the power to stop them. But I don't want them to expand. And he was a huge believer in this idea of African recolonization, of taking freed African American people, uprooting them from the place they lived their whole lives and generations before, either free or enslaved, and making them leave to go to Africa, a place they'd never been or knew anything about. Lincoln believed in that, right to the fact that the practical limitations of this weren't there. His mind is moving on the question of race. And where he was when he entered the White House in 1861 is not where he was when he left to go to the theater in April of 1865. What we don't know is where would he have been if he filled out his 4 years of trying to be a post-war president, reconstructing this country on some grounds of freedom and equality for all. What would that have looked like with Lincoln at the helm? We'll never know. Good question. I see another one in the chat about McClellan's firing. Can I read the question? I know that Lincoln initially approved of and then fired McClellan, but did the election further ruin their relationship? What was McClellan's response to the assassination? Are there McClellan presidential conspiracies out there? I don't think there's any. Let's go from back to front. I don't think there's any conspiracies. McClellan didn't have anything to do with the assassination. I don't think he probably shed a tear when Lincoln was shot. But I do know they had no relationship once Lincoln fired him the last time. The letters that McClellan writes to his wife clearly, and some letters that end up being public, about what he thought about Lincoln intellectually, morally, spiritually, are so cutting. And I mean, if Lincoln was a Southern gentleman of the old school and it was along the lines of Andrew Jackson, McClellan and Lincoln would have met out in the field of honor with pistols at dawn. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that McClellan had written about Lincoln. Lincoln doesn't say as cutting of things personally about McClellan. He just wants McClellan to do his job, which is to try to win the war as opposed to build an army. And McClellan kind of got to the army building part and then never really had either the ability or the stomach, is what a lot of those cartoons insinuate, the stomach to win the war, whereas Grant will. Good question. Any others? Do you have some more out there, Jen?
I'm looking through. I did have one come to me directly. Maybe say a little bit more about the role of the vice president. You know, that was an interesting part of this talk and where history, you know, ended up going, but maybe compared to now or, you know, what we look at or.
It's really fascinating when you think of life expectancy and what could kill you in the 19th century. The most people on this call probably know the William Henry Harrison story, giving the longest speech. I don't want to do that here, but the longest inauguration speech, and then have the shortest presidency, and then ending up with John Tyler, who's an absolute politically opposite of William Henry Harrison. And that's who the president is. So the thought of who the vice president would be, I mean, the goal for most of these politicians would be to balance a ticket, but not to make a governing partnership. That's really interesting. That's changed over the course of the last, I'd say, 40 years. I think the real first vice president duo where you're getting two for the price of one, and they're both on the same page about what they're doing and when, would have been probably Carter Mondale in 1976. Not that Mondale had a lot of official duties, but the two of them were fairly connected politically and ideologically, and they knew each other. When you get to Reagan and Bush in 1980, that may have not started to be the case. And George Herbert Walker Bush was a fundamentally different person than Ronald Reagan, but he's definitely a skilled politician and knew what he needed to do to stay in Reagan's good graces. And ever since those two presidencies, we've seen a more of a 2-for-1 selling of the vice presidential ticket. Certainly this last time. I mean, I think many Biden voters were voting as much for Kamala Harris as they were for Joe Biden. So that's kind of a new thing in American politics. But you would have thought, with life expectancy being shorter, accidents happen. Zachary Taylor eats some strawberries. People died. And then suddenly you're left with, who's the president? And in this case of Andrew Johnson, it's so tragic. Of all of the people, just constitutionally, emotionally, character, intellectually unqualified to be president of the United States, you'd be hard for us to find somebody on that category more than this man. He is a kind of a tragic figure in some respects, but he had no business being in the Oval Office from either party. And yet that's where he was when Lincoln dies at the theater. So it's a great question. I don't understand why that hadn't been a larger concern before this. When you look at the last assassination of an American president, of John F. Kennedy in 1963, the successful assassination, and if you know the history of the Johnson-Kennedy relationship, how fraught that was. But Johnson had dreamed his whole life of being the president. He prepared for that job. He knew what he would do if he ever got it. And when the Kennedy offer to be on the ticket to balance it off and bring Texas along came, he took it and gave up his role in the Senate. He was an amazingly powerful figure in the Senate. I don't think he planned on Kennedy dying, and where he would have been had Kennedy been reelected or run through 64 is a good question. But this idea of a partnership is new. Since I would say, anybody else on the call would say, I'd say Carter Mondale is their first model for this. Other questions?
I'm looking for anyone if they have hands raised. Not everyone has video.
Yep.
There's a few other comments in there, it looks like.
And there's a second one about the Democrats and Republicans here in the 19th century. The parties have essentially changed places. My students at Interlochen largely tilt from the left side of the aisle. And I always tell them in 1856 and 1860, you would be Republicans. They would be in favor of, I showed them a Republican Party platform and they, oh yeah, I like that. Well, that's what they would have been. And Democrats were a mix. They were a bigger tent. They always have been. And that big tent included Southern Democrats, Northern Democrats, urban, poor farmers. But the race aspect was prevalent in both parties. But when you look at the Republican Party, its only reason for being is to stop the expansion of slavery. Not to end it necessarily, but to stop it expanding. And within that, they took in old Whig ideas of where the government should be on economics and things like that. The Reconstruction and the failure of Reconstruction, the tragedy of Reconstruction, will be the beginning of this end of where the question of where African-American rights and freedoms matter in the Republican world of policy. And when Reconstruction is over and Plessy v. Ferguson comes out in 1896, you get kind of both parties done with race as a question to divide them. They both have agreed to have a white supremacy outlet on politics. My beginning of the lecture, I said, America's been a democracy, functional democracy, since 1965. It's not been a democracy for very long. Not in a functional sense of the word. Just talk to somebody who grew up in Mississippi in the 50s and you tell me if that's democracy. So, other questions? This has been, if there's no more, this has been great. I hope this has been helpful and people have learned a little bit about this election and what it meant.
Absolutely. Yeah. And thanks, Brian. I want to let everyone know that these are recorded. And so you can always rewatch these presentations on the Traverse Area District Library YouTube channel. It's TADL, not just books. And we're trying to put on these monthly presentations with the help of the library. So that's been great. Yeah, I think that is all the questions. Again, thank you, Brian. Thank you everyone for joining in here.
Before we go, I want to make a pitch for, if you haven't seen the movie Lincoln, you really should. If this is an interesting topic to you and the question of where we've come on race in America and the aftermath of George Floyd's death and murder this summer, and where Abraham Lincoln fits in the story, the larger story of America's wrestling with this question. That movie it's not completely accurate, but that's not the point. You'll have a feel for where politics is still the same in some respects and where it's come from. I really highly recommend people watch it if they haven't seen it yet.
Great. Yep.
Thank you very much, folks, for listening and appreciate it.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.